Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Forum. I'm Bryce Yonker. Today we have with us David Terry. David's coming from the other side of the country of me and is the president and CEO of Nasio. Thanks for being on, David.
Thanks, Bryce. Great to chat with you.
So I'll let you describe your acronym and yourself there. I missed one of the letters last time I was saying it myself. So tell us a little bit about Nasio. Tell us who you are there.
You bet. Nasio, the National Association of State Energy Officials. These are the 56 governor-designated state energy directors and their offices, the states and territories in the District of Columbia. In most of the states, about 81, 82% of them, the governor appoints, or the director serves at the pleasure of the governor. It has a policy function primarily, not a regulatory one. So think about informing governor actions on energy, legislative actions on energy policy, engaging a lot with the private sector. There's a lot of private sector work in this space. And the members are all a little different, as states are, but broadly speaking, they cover every energy area imaginable, as we do. Nuclear power, efficiency, transmission, distribution, petroleum products, energy emergencies, building energy codes, industrial efficiency, storage, offshore wind. It's a long list, but it makes it really exciting. So the members are engaged in most of that, depending upon their region. Obviously, we're not doing offshore wind in Kansas. We're doing onshore wind, but depending upon their area and their priorities, that's what we work on with them. We spend about half of our time sharing information from state to state so they can develop policies, operate programs, and about the other half of our time working on federal engagement. That may mean informing the administration, a lot of congressional activities, and also engaging with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and other agencies, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, et cetera.
Thanks. And David, you've been working in and around energy and state work for some time. What's at the top of the list for the states now? Is that dramatically different than it was a few years ago or many years ago? How are things evolving around what's at the top of the list for states around energy?
It is pretty different. It won't surprise you, or probably many of the listeners, but getting power on the grid to meet demand is definitely at the top of the list. It's great timing for the question. We just finished our 6 regional meetings. We have 6 regions across the country. We held events in Anchorage, Alaska, and Boston, and Raleigh, and Denver, and places in between. And the theme that came out is they're responding to their governor and industry requests to any way they can find ways to get clean, affordable power on the grid. Reliable and affordable are key terms, not surprising. But I think the change there is a recognition that we have sort of a near, medium, long-term need here that all have to happen at the same time. And what we heard were states trying to address near-term advanced conductoring activities that will provide power at greater volumes in places where that's possible in order to even out grid demands, especially related to data centers, but manufacturing, electrification, a whole host of reasons. And those near-term items coupled with medium-term items, which might be faster permitting, it might be some supply chain issues, variety of generation sources, and then longer-term items such as advanced nuclear, geothermal power, et cetera. So really kind of that whole package is what we're hearing. And a lot coming from state legislators that are suddenly interested in energy in a bigger way than many have been. Certainly, they're always interested, but right now you see a lot of new legislation coming out, and that's kind of the top priority. I think that the affordability piece of this is maybe not obvious, especially if you live in a low power cost region or even if you live in a high power cost region, you look across at some region that has very low power costs, say some of the Midwest, for example. But it's the relative change compared to what you have been paying that affects consumers and businesses. And so a lot of states are dealing with that issue. I think the other item that we heard loud and clear is this focus on private sector engagement and innovation, trying to figure out how they can give a leg up to the state's economic advantage through energy, but in non-energy areas. Maybe that's some kind of manufacturing, whatever the activity may be. So the economic development piece of this is really prominent in the discussions around energy.
Well, there's a lot there, and I don't know if we'll be able to dive on everything. And we haven't actually announced this, but we're going to focus our main event next year on affordability in a modern grid. So maybe that's a secret or soft announcement for the deep cut listeners here. let's talk about load growth. And I know you mentioned that kind of around a lot of your remarks there. Demand forecasts have ticked up quite a bit in the last, I used to say 18 months. Maybe those first versions of those came out now about 2 years ago. You mentioned all the states working to find ways to interconnect, new resources. What are states prioritizing around how they meet the day, meet the need, with regards to potentially, more serious demand that we're seeing on the grid?
I think several big threads, and I'll save the last one, which is a little bit more forward looking. But I think this, on the near term side, they really are looking for what levers they can pull that will get new generation online, whether it's utility scale or behind the meter, whatever it is. How can they get it on faster so they don't lose either the economic development opportunity or negatively impact prices? And some of that is literally, trying to permit more quickly, whether that's solar and storage or new gas generation, et cetera, but things that are nearer term. Another great example, and I guess it's maybe that medium term category, we just left our regional meeting in the West, which was held in Alaska, and there's a great hydroelectric project there that's been operating for quite a number of years. They're adding an additional, there's a nearby river that captures melt from glacier. That's being moved into this hydroelectric facility to add more power, because even in Alaska, you don't think about that being a big power demand change, but they have economic growth too, and power, certainly affordability issues. So they're looking, that's an option for them. You see a lot of levers being pulled that wouldn't have been looked at 3, 4, 5 years ago, unique to each state's circumstance. So I think that's one. The second area is just a recognition that there are obviously federal permitting and state and local permitting things that can happen more slowly or quickly, depending on things we try to streamline or do. But one of the really tricky ones is getting local communities ready to accept new power projects, whatever that is. It could be something controversial, it could be something simple. But if the local population isn't informed about, in a really honest, straightforward way, here's the impact, pros, cons, what you can expect, what you should expect of the developer, of the utility, or whoever it is. We see a lot of energy offices trying to get out in front, being just a really good convener and educator of, this is what a power project of a particular type would mean for your community. These are the pluses and minuses of it, and trying to meet them where they are, answer their questions. And that piece of speeding power development projects is really critical. And we hear that from every sector: nuclear, solar, wind, transmission, you name it. And I think that's an important step. The third one is a little bit, as I said, forward-looking, but I think it's an important one. There's been a recognition, we've heard this from our members for a number of years, that in general, and there's some exceptions, but in general, load forecasting is not great. Utilities do their load forecasting. Some of the RTOs are engaged in that. A lot of people engaged in it. But I think there's been a belief that sometimes the policy, distinct from regulation, but the policies that a state pursues around economic development or energy and what have you, things that impact energy, aren't always well reflected in load forecasts that are being done by others, whether that's the utility or another government entity or whoever it is. And so the energy offices, and we see this there's at least 2 or 3 offices in every region that are looking at this. How can we get better at load forecasting so that we're not overbuilding or underbuilding? You don't want to overbuild either, obviously. And one of the interesting things that one of the states is doing, and they've asked to keep it quiet for the moment because they're still working through sort of the details of it, but it's a very interesting approach. They're taking the load forecasts they have from the utilities, which have not been as accurate as they would like, and they're not able to meet the demand they'd like to meet. And they're overlaying everything they know about the geospatial data associated with the economic development sites in their state, the major sites like big brownfields, big greenfields, things that will be developed over time. And they're looking at different models that put those two together so that they have a better sense of what's possible and likely, and they can plan better. And I think this load forecasting area is one that I think we'll see a lot more news on that out of the states and also out of Congress. There's a lot of interest in Congress at getting better in this. We recognize that's a little longer term item. It doesn't answer the mail today, but I think it's a piece of the puzzle. And I guess just the last thought on that, there's where data centers in particular are concerned, there's sort of this constant question of, are we accidentally double counting just by virtue of how they're happening? And I think The answer to some degree is yes, but the answer is also the computing demand is going to increase incredibly, not just the data center build, but the actual demand for the computing computational power. And so I think that's another piece of this, wanting to get that forecast right so that they're not impacting ratepayers. But I got a little off track,
You're fine.
but
And
it's
I'm going to
interesting.
go a little deeper here, right? I can't remember what commercial it was, but there's kind of no easy button for
There's
adding
the
no, significant load, or for the gamers, there's no, no cheat code. But maybe you can talk a little bit about, interconnection queue and maybe areas that we can unlock some resources there. You mentioned grid enhancing technologies. I think there's a lot of promise in looking to scale that. And I think if there's one thing that doesn't have an easy aspect, it's transmission capacity
yeah.
expansions. But like, what's making it so hard? And what are some of the promising areas that you think we really can be addressing effectively right now?
I think the interconnection queues are obviously a huge area, and I think MISO's done a lot of work to improve that. I think there are some lessons to be learned from what they've done, where they've made pretty tremendous improvements. I think there's more work to be done in some of the other RTOs on interconnection, but honestly, I think the other challenging piece of this beyond interconnection queues is we lack enough transformers if no matter what you want to do, and that's an ongoing problem, and there's a delay there that worries me more than the interconnection queue because of the time lag, the lack of domestic production. Just to me, that's a bigger issue, and I think the states generally feel the same way. As concerned as they are about interconnection, they're also concerned about the supply chain element that may be limiting for any kind of power generation or upgrades. I think the other piece for the interconnection queues and engagement with the RTOs, I think some of the RTOs have gotten much better about engaging state policymakers, legislators, governors, energy directors, and some have not. And the reason that's important is the regulator role at the state level is distinct and different, really critical. But it is one more of, once the policy is passed at the state level, how is it implemented? And I think the RTOs would benefit from getting both of those pieces as opposed to mostly one. I think that would help. I think that would help the utility industry as well, just because this is complicated. It's amazing that we keep the lights on sometimes, I think, when you could think about how complex the system is and the demands that we put on it and put on the providers. I think they need as much information as they can get, and I don't think that they're getting it. So I think that's something for both us to do and for them to do together. I think in the grid enhancing technology area, this strikes me as, it's not quite a free lunch, but it's pretty close. As good close as it's going to get, I think. And I really firmly believe we have to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to do all these things at the same time, but this is one we should push to the front of the line, whether it's advanced conductors or dynamic line ratings, et cetera. I would add to that technologies that allowed automated load management. California is doing some really fascinating work in that area, as you're well aware. I think that suite of technologies has the ability to help put downward pressure on rates. They're still going up, but at least it puts downward pressure on, and they're pretty practical and sensible. And so we are pushing hard on that. We've actually been talking to the Department of Energy about standing up a larger state collaborative with them to really elevate this. I think the utilities need signals from the governors and the legislatures that, we need to move in this area more aggressively. Actually, we've seen some state legislation passed in that regard this legislative season that's really kind of just wrapping up for most of the states. NASU will do a summary of bills that have passed, and you'll see some of those pop up. So I'm kind of excited about those. I think those are really great opportunities.
Well, I'm going to take the bait on what can put downward rate pressure on rates, since I'm so curious about that. I took an interview this last week on that topic myself. Couldn't agree with you more that deploying grid enhancing technologies at scale could be one of those levers. What are some of the other areas that you think hold some promise that need at least as much attention as possible? How optimistic are you that we can, slow the rate of the rate increases, which have really been coming along pretty actively?
I think, and this is just my opinion, but I in general, if you assume that natural gas is a huge part of our generation mix, it is, and solar and wind, obviously, all three of those, the fuel costs couldn't be any lower. I don't know how the gas producers put out natural gas at the price they do in the United States, but at any rate, it isn't the fuel cost, right? It's the cost of all items which have gone up in the grid space, equipment, et cetera. Certainly, it's necessary increases, high demand for them. But the time lost and time value of money that is lost through extensive permitting, state and federal, local opposition, some of which is warranted, some's not. I think working through those soft costs, I would call them soft costs. They're complicated issues, but they're soft costs. We have an opportunity to close that time value of money gap that's being wasted on permitting processes that are either too long, or maybe the inappropriate place was chosen to begin with, or advanced education wasn't done, whether it's by the state or the developer, whoever it is. I think the optimism I have about that being a place that we can address. You see states that have taken action trying to get in front of that education and permitting front. Governor Little from Idaho has proposed a sort of, I don't know if I'd call it a one-stop shop, but something like a one-stop shop to better streamline and move permitting in just a fundamentally both safe and faster way. And I think those kind of actions can put downward rate pressure. And lastly, it is that automated load management item that I mentioned. And this is where good load forecasting comes in. To what extent we can reduce load by shifting it, not traditional demand response, but truly automated, dependable load management, and how that affects our load forecasting. It's a mouthful, but I think there's a cost savings there. If electricity could truly be stored in massive volumes and accessed, we'd do it differently, right? So let's take a version of that in automated load management. So we're really interested in that as a reduction. There's one other one. It is. I bring it up. I only know of one company that makes the technology, and so I don't mean to be pitching for a particular company, but Form Energy, their long duration battery that is no critical minerals, no rare earths of any kind. Their first real commercial one going into Minnesota soon. Their first truly large scale, the largest utility scale battery in the country will be installed in Maine in the next couple of years. That's a really interesting opportunity to reduce power costs over the long term. And we'll see how it models out and how the technology performs, but certainly all signs are it's very positive development in the storage area.
Well, in my interview, one of my arguments was deployment of demand side management at scale could be one of those levers that we need to do.
Absolutely.
And I like how you're saying, the next side of capabilities of that. I think, worth a shout out on energy efficiency because it's a least cost resource to deploy at scale.
Absolutely.
Long duration storage might not have been the thing I would have put in for the lowering costs, but I can't agree with you more that the grid needs it, right? We need that solution to help firm up our power supply. But I'm going to take your thread on permitting, actually. And if you don't mind, permitting reform at the federal level kind of always is the next bill. So I don't know where this will lead us to on current things that are happening. Do you feel, the administration has been very aggressively talking about prioritizing this. Do you feel that the landscape is possible, that we really can have some significant federal permitting reform, or likely is most of this action to happen at the state level? Because we really have not been able to get to this domino yet federally for quite some time.
We need it on the federal side. Certainly there's work to do in state and local governments and the things I mentioned, but we need federal permitting reform on the federal side. I think it's important that be bipartisan so that it's well supported. We supported the Senator Manchin, Senator Barrasso's bill last Congress because we thought that it was probably the best we could possibly have gotten, and it wasn't perfect, but it had a lot of great attributes to it. And we pushed hard on our end and had a lot of state support for it because we believed it was A, important, and B, maybe one of the best chances we'd have in the foreseeable future. And this Congress is right now, this year is fully booked, I think, with appropriations issues, tax issues, and hopefully they'll get to these items, but it's a challenge. The clock runs out awfully quickly. So I'm not optimistic this year. I am optimistic this Congress that we'll get something done. And I think the Senate Energy Committee has always shown a good bipartisanship. The House Energy Committee under the leadership of Mr. Latta, I'm sure will as well. So I'd like to think if we can't do it this year, which is pretty likely, hopefully we can next year. I think that bill was a good basis to start from.
Great. Can we talk a little bit about federal policy in general? How is the role of states versus federal with regard to all kinds of, executive orders, all kinds of maybe shifting energy priorities? Maybe at a macro level, where are things now? Where do we currently stand? What sort of signals are we getting from the federal government on what role states have and maybe changing role states have? How's that environment in motion right now?
Yeah, I think it's still a little bit dynamic, and we're finding our respective ways. There are a couple of the executive orders that I think have been incredibly helpful. In terms of bringing attention to the need to get power on the grid, for example, the focus on nuclear. Many of the states are engaged on that as an example. The advanced conductoring items that have been in executive order. The digitization of federal permitting is another one that a lot of people missed, which I think is important. It almost sounds like surely it's been done, but it hasn't. So that's good
Yep.
news. I think places where the federal government is or at least the administration is pushing into traditionally state jurisdictional roles around decisions they're making on emissions or cost issues that directly affect the ratepayers or the energy consumers, if it's in the case of it being non-electricity. I think those are places where the states have concerns. The use of the 202C executive order, or excuse me, the 202C Federal Power Act emergency order to keep power plants open is traditionally been done at the request of the governor or through the state. The most recent actions were done unilaterally by the federal government, which is certainly within the statute. It is permitted. I think that's challenging, if only because ultimately the ratepayer in that state will bear the cost of whatever that change is. And so I think it's important for there to be state engagement when that happens, not to prevent it, but to work through it, hopefully collaboratively. And that's a place where I see both an opportunity to work with the administration and the federal government, but also a challenge. It's important to work through the costs of that. Our utility regulatory commissions are well suited to that task. I certainly, it is above my pay grade to assign that to anybody, but they're the ones that understand those dynamics. And I think more engagement before those 202C orders are taken unilaterally by the federal government would be a very good idea.
The budgets at state energy offices often do rely on federal resources. That's in motion. Are there areas where maybe questions are uncertain, or clarity is still looking? Your members are still looking for more clarity on funds that would or may not be coming from federal agencies for certain
Yeah,
outcomes?
also really timely. We've worked really closely with the administration and the House and Senate, particularly the Republican leadership, and they have been very supportive of the funds that have been obligated to the energy offices in a variety of programs. The 401(d), grid resilience money in particular, some of the transmission funds, the GRIP funds, so all those grid deployment office activities, if you will. The U.S. State Energy Program, which supports a lot of the energy emergency work, the energy planning work, transmission planning work, that has also gotten a green light, really across the board. I think the principal place we are now that's challenging is that there were really serious procurement challenges just because of the bandwidth, the number of people working in procurement. They have a pretty tough job. They have a fiduciary responsibility to carry out the agreements and funding commitments, whether it's states or private sector. We now have about 50% fewer procurement staff working at the Department of Energy than we did 6 months ago. So that is going to be a slow path. I know Secretary Wright has been in the process of reviewing their programs and their approach and a likely reorganization. Hopefully that will be done soon. So right now it's less concern about not about a lack of support from Congress. It's more a concern about how do we expedite getting funds out. There are some areas, some of the topics we just talked about. I think we want those dollars out the door as quick as we can to get power on the grid, to be more efficient, you name it, bring prices down, whether that's a grid program or a security program, et cetera. It is interesting. We have a nuclear first movers initiative with 11 states that the governor has asked the energy offices to lead in those states. And in almost every case, they're using state energy program funds that are federal funds that are annually appropriated. And there's some IIJA funds in that category. They're using those for planning, modeling, analysis to try to move that more quickly and figure out, how they can make that happen. Obviously, there's a federal aspect to nuclear, but that's a good example. And so we're seeing support for that. But I think procurement is going to be a challenge, and I feel for the folks doing it. They have a tough job.
Costly distribution upgrades, frequent extreme weather events, demand surging from an onslaught of distributed energy resources adoption. Do these challenges sound familiar? If so, you need Virtual Peaker's cloud-based distributed energy platform. We're empowering modern utilities with next-generation virtual power plant solutions to maximize the value of DERs. The virtual peaker platform unifies all aspects of DER management, from DERMS to customer engagement and demand forecasting. Learn more at virtual-peaker.com.
Can we talk as much as you're comfortable on the current legislation in motion with the reconciliation package?
Sure.
So there's, a number of rescissions of unobligated funds, mostly IRA. There's the expedited, kind of phase down of the tax incentives. What sort of impact does this have at, states or where are you all, seeing the important energy aspects of what they're talking about?
Yeah, it's principally in the tax area. On the funding side, there's not a lot of impact. Most of the funds had been obligated. Most of the funds in the IIJA were broadly agreed to by really in truly bipartisan fashion. Many Republicans involved, and that's pretty well supported. On the tax side, every state has some level of disappointment in a rollback, whether it's efficiency tax credits in residential, multifamily. In the case of commercial buildings and public buildings, the House did not roll back the 179D tax deduction or credit, but the Senate has. So we'll see how that plays out. That's a concern. Certainly the PTC and the ITC for solar and wind are a concern, particularly offshore wind. That's a concern. The continuation for geothermal, nuclear, and storage, et cetera, is good news, but there's a big sort of wrinkle in that. The foreign entity issue is understandable, but it's incredibly complicated and counterintuitive, and it's going to be, I think, from what we have talked with states and industry in the last couple of weeks about this, I think they all agree that it may not be workable as currently crafted. They get the purpose and are supportive, but as currently crafted, it's really problematic. So even in those handful of cases where the credits continue, nuclear, et cetera, that particular element will make it extremely difficult to use. So I'm pretty optimistic that will get worked out. It is one that I think in the past, when we've had sort of not the equivalent, but where we've had Buy American provisions that everybody supports, then the detail is, well, how do you make that work in cases where it can't in the near term, but could in the long term? And so I think that's what we have to work out.
This is pretty specific, but we were a bit maybe surprised to see 45X adjustments in there. I mean, I think that domestic production of critical supply chains seems like something that would be universally supported, and you pull out an incentive that seems to be counterintuitive. Are you guys similarly a bit surprised, or do you think why address a very effective tool like that?
Yeah, I am surprised, and I can't figure out the why. I'm assuming there's a why, but we haven't gotten to the bottom of it, but as to the reasoning behind it. But it does seem counterproductive to both the congressional goals and the administration's goals, and certainly the state goals. So we have not gotten to the bottom of what that's about, what we're missing, but I very much agree. It was an odd one to target for this.
We're getting near the end of our time. I wanted to weave it in earlier, but you just gave me so many good things to follow up on. I want to talk a little bit about resilience. We have talked about affordability, and I think those two things have some significant trade-offs. Each state essentially has had their chance with having to deal with some sort of a catastrophic event. How are state energy offices able to deal when it's their turn? How do they prepare? How do they price? How do they value? What do they learn when things happen? I know there's a lot of embedded questions there, but maybe you can share a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on in that space.
As it is my favorite topic, I'm really pleased you asked. It is for a number of reasons. The energy offices have been doing energy security work for years, and resilience is part of that security work. Every office has just completed a really massive overhaul of their state energy security plans. That was something specified in the IIJA legislation that passed to enhance those plans, renew them, make them more robust. They're really extraordinary. They contain volumes on risk assessments in different energy sectors, both fuels, grid, et cetera, critical end use, energy end use facilities, for example, just the whole gamut. And so states have had a really unique opportunity to drill down further. And I think in particular of states that haven't had as many, really large scale disasters like massive wildfires, massive hurricanes, et cetera, which is obviously a blessing. The downside of that is they wouldn't have had those systems tested. So the new security plans that every state has at least has a good foundational place to start from there. The other place in resilience that I think has been helpful that dovetailed, at least on the grid side, with the various GRIP funded activities. And I think that put on the radar screen for legislators, utilities, governors in a bigger way, the linkage between these state energy security plans that look at risk, identify interdependencies, the really critical part of it between grid, fuels, and major end use sectors and telecommunications, and the opportunities they have and where the biggest bang for the buck is. I think we're still figuring out in many cases where the biggest bang for the buck is because there's not enough money to go around no matter how it's paid for. And I think that's one of the pieces we're still working through. I'd have to give a shout out in particular, Florida has and Georgia as well have had, more than their fair share, obviously, of hurricanes, much as some of the states in the West have dealt with wildfires. But it also means they've really connected those dots on interdependencies, whether it's building codes, energy efficiency, undergrounding of utilities where that makes sense, the response capability. They've really learned from that. And so we've tried to take that lesson to other states that experience different kinds of disasters. And I think this linkage between the revised state energy security plans, the grid resilience activities, and frankly, the number of disasters we've had in different categories, including polar vortex, of course, that's occurred and freezes. So I think those are the positives. The negatives are we're having these events and people are harmed, businesses are harmed, lives are lost, et cetera. But I think we're getting better at it. And if there's a big wish I have, coming out of, it's not really so much a money question as it is an attention. When you don't have a lot of disasters, it's easy to forget about it, or it's easy to deprioritize it. We need to prioritize it. And I think we need our leadership, certainly federal, state, and local levels, to keep it prioritized because it doesn't matter till it matters. I guess the last one I would add in that category is we worry a lot about cybersecurity. And, unlike wildfires and hurricanes that happen typically in fairly specific geographic areas that hopefully we can get better prepared for, it happens everywhere. And we've been pretty successful at keeping it from having a truly great impact other than the cost of it. But we've been both good and lucky. And I think we need to get better.
I can't agree more. We could end there, but I got one last question for you. How much of a balance would you say does public policy and regulation, and maybe we'll lump into that things like incentives or regulatory processes and rates, versus the market signals, supply, demand, prices, supply chain, labor availability? How much do those two camps play into one another with regard to the things that we're actually deciding to build on our grid and that state energy offices are dealing with alongside so many other stakeholders?
It's a really good question and a really critical interaction. And I think it's one of the reasons I love working with the energy offices so much. Their charge is, if you will, to engage the private sector. So you get that market signal. Really, it's really easy to access if you listen and you engage, and they do. I think the challenging part then is oftentimes market signals are nearer term. They might be now, a year from now, 2 or 3 years from now. They're often not 10 years from now. And I think that's where the policy planning, especially load forecasting we talked about earlier, but just energy planning broadly writ, that looks out 8-10 years at the resources a state has, the things that are likely to occur, none of us really know, but looking ahead. And I think that's where it tilts more toward the public sector side, the policy element, if you will, and less toward the private markets in the near term. I don't know where that dividing line is, but the near term, really those market signals are the drivers. And I think, we listen to those really carefully. If you look at any NASIO conference agenda, you see it front and center.
David Terry from NASIO, thanks for being on with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks again to our season sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Forward Forum, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.